Inspector General Thane Krix had clearly never been snarled at by 12 predator cubs simultaneously, because if he had, he would have approached Training Station Atlas with a lot more backup and significantly better life insurance. The sound that emerged from those young throats when he announced his transfer orders was the kind of harmonious threat display that made seasoned warriors reconsider their career choices, and pacifists suddenly appreciate the value of heavy armor plating. Standing between the cubs and their bureaucratic nightmare was Captain Arya Stone, whose expression suggested she was calculating exactly how many regulations she was about to violate, and finding the number surprisingly comfortable. I'm Dr. Vel Torgan, Nixari behavioral analyst, and what I was witnessing wasn't just administrative overreach meeting pack loyalty. It was 3 centuries of educational orthodoxy, about to collide with the most spectacularly bonded interspecies family unit in galactic history. The trouble started when Inspector General Thane Krix arrived for his routine evaluation of what he delicately termed irregular educational practices. Krix was a Velkari, whose idea of proper education involved rigid discipline, species segregation, and the kind of institutional thinking that made creative problem-solving a punishable offense. Captain Stone, he announced, his armor plates gleaming with self-importance under the station's artificial lighting. I'm here to assess the educational effectiveness of your unconventional methods. Captain Stone looked up from where she was conducting tactical analysis with her cubs, all 12 of them arranged around her like a living demonstration of interspecies cooperation. Inspector General, welcome to Training Station Atlas. Would you like to observe our current session? Actually, Krix replied with the kind of smile that made smart beings check their escape routes. I'm here to implement new standards that will bring this facility into compliance with proper educational protocols. The cubs, who had been engaged in what looked like an advanced strategic planning session, suddenly went very still. Not the stillness of attention, but the predatory stillness that comes right before something extremely unpleasant happens to anyone perceived as a threat. New standards? Stone asked carefully, her tone carrying that particular quality that humans developed when they sensed incoming bureaucratic nonsense. Indeed, Krix activated his datapad with theatrical flourish. Effective immediately, all predator cubs will be transferred to species-appropriate educational facilities, where they can receive proper instruction from their own kind. If he'd announced that gravity was optional and breathing was being canis discontinued, the reaction couldn't have been more dramatic. Rax, a young Thraxian male whose chitinous plates were just developing their adult coloration, was the first to respond. His mandibles began clicking in patterns that my translator struggled to process, but the emotional content was unmistakably hostile. You want to take us away from Captain Stone? He asked, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that made experienced warriors nervous. Not take, Krix corrected with bureaucratic precision. Transfer to appropriate educational environments where you can learn proper social behaviors from members of your own species. That's when Kea, a small Koran female whose armor plating was still soft with youth, made a sound that I'd never heard from her species before. It started as a low growl and escalated into something that made the station's structural supports vibrate sympathetically. We don't want proper social behaviors, she snarled, her developing claws extending in what Koran military manuals described as pre-combat configuration. We want to stay with our pack leader. Inspector Krix looked genuinely surprised, as if he'd never encountered cubs who had opinions about their own education. Young one, you don't understand the benefits of species-appropriate instruction. You'll learn traditions, cultural values, and proper behavioral patterns from your own kind. I understand perfectly, Kea replied, her voice dropping to frequencies that made everyone present suddenly aware of their own mortality. You want to break up our pack because it makes you uncomfortable. The other cubs began moving. Not obviously threatening, but definitely repositioning themselves into what anyone familiar with predator behavior would recognize as a defensive formation around Captain Stone. Mila, a young Nixari whose compound eyes were tracking every movement in the room, spoke with the kind of precision that made her species such effective strategists. Inspector Krix, your transfer orders assume that genetic similarity equals educational compatibility. This assumption is flawed. How so? Krix asked, apparently deciding that engaging in academic debate with juveniles was somehow going to support his position. Because effective education requires emotional safety and psychological trust, she explained with the patience of someone teaching basic concepts to a slow learner. We have developed these conditions with Captain Stone through demonstrated competence and mutual respect. Your transfer orders would destroy these conditions for theoretical benefits that may not materialize. Krix's armor plates shifted into what Velkari diplomacy manuals described as patronizing authority. Child, you're too young to understand the complexities of proper education. Trust the adults to make decisions in your best interest. The silence that followed this statement was so profound that I could hear the station's atmospheric processors 3 decks away. Then Zane, a human boy whose parents had died in the Nexari conflict, stepped forward with an expression that would have made his late father proud. Inspector, he said with the kind of calm that preceded spectacular violence, with all due respect, which adults are we supposed to trust? The ones who separated us from everything we knew and called it education? The ones who told us our emotional bonds were inappropriate? Or the one who actually listened to us and helped us become who we're supposed to be? Krix looked around the room, apparently beginning to realize that his routine administrative visit had somehow become a philosophical challenge to the entire foundation of galactic education policy. The Galactic Education Authority has centuries of experience in child development, he said, his voice carrying less conviction than before. The Galactic Education Authority, Rax observed, his clicking mandibles creating complex harmonic patterns, has centuries of experience in producing compliant citizens who follow orders without question. Captain Stone has taught us to think for ourselves. Which is exactly the problem, Krix declared, finally revealing his actual objections. These cubs are developing inappropriate independence and questioning authority structures. They need to learn proper respect for institutional hierarchy. Captain Stone, who had been quietly observing this exchange, finally spoke. Inspector, are you suggesting that independent thinking is a problem? I'm suggesting that children need structure, discipline, and appropriate role models from their own species. Why? Mila asked with Nexari directness that cut straight to the heart of complex issues. What specific benefits does species segregation provide that integrated education cannot? Krix opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again as he realized he was being asked to defend assumptions that nobody had ever questioned before. Traditional methods, he said finally, have proven effective for maintaining social stability. Social stability, Kia repeated thoughtfully. For whom? The question hung in the air like a live grenade with a faulty timer. For everyone, Krix replied, but his confidence was wavering. Not for us, Zane said quietly. Traditional methods told us we were problems to be managed. Captain Stone taught us we were people to be valued. She taught us, Rax added, his mandibles clicking in patterns that conveyed deep emotional content, that being different from others doesn't mean being inferior to others. Most importantly, Mila concluded, she taught us that family is something you choose, not something you're assigned. Inspector Krix looked around the room at 12 young predators who were demonstrating levels of emotional intelligence, tactical thinking, and philosophical sophistication that most adults never achieved. His bureaucratic mind was clearly struggling to process information that contradicted his fundamental assumptions about child development. Nevertheless, he said, falling back on administrative authority when logic failed, regulations are regulations. The transfer orders are effective immediately. That's when the cubs showed him exactly what they thought of his regulations. The movement was so coordinated, it looked choreographed. 12 predator cubs, from 6 different species, arranged themselves in a perfect defensive formation that put Captain Stone at the center and created overlapping fields of protection that would have impressed military tacticians. But they weren't just positioning for defense. They were making a statement that transcended species boundaries and challenged every assumption about child psychology that had ever been written into official policy. No, Kia said simply, her soft armor plates beginning to harden as stress triggered her species' natural defensive responses. Excuse me? Krix's voice carried the dangerous calm of someone whose authority had never been challenged by beings less than half his size. "We said no," Rax clarified, his mandibles creating sounds that made the station's bulkheads vibrate with harmonic frequencies. "We're not going anywhere. Children don't get to refuse lawful administrative orders," Krix declared, activating his communicator to summon security reinforcements. "We're not refusing administrative orders," Mila corrected with typical Nexari precision. "We're exercising our right to educational self-determination as recognized under Article 47 of the Galactic Charter of Individual Rights." The fact that a juvenile Nexari had just cited specific legal precedent made Krix pause his communication request. "You're minors," he protested. "You don't have self-determination rights." "Actually," Zane said, producing a datapad that contained what appeared to be extensive legal research, "we do. Article 47 specifically states that beings of any age have the right to refuse educational placements that would cause psychological harm or emotional distress, and force separation from chosen pack leaders." Kia added with a snarl that carried genuine menace. "Definitely qualifies as psychological harm." Inspector Krix was beginning to look like someone whose routine administrative task had transformed into a legal and philosophical quagmire that threatened to undermine his entire worldview. "How do you know about Article 47? He asked weakly. "Captain Stone taught us to research the systems that govern our lives," Rax explained, his clicking patterns creating what sounded almost like laughter. "She said that understanding your rights is the first step to protecting them. She also taught us," Mila added, with compound eyes that seemed to see everything, "that bullies rely on ignorance to maintain power. Knowledge is the best defense against institutional abuse." The accusation of institutional abuse hit Krix like a physical blow. His armor plates began shifting into defensive configurations as he processed the implications of cubs who understood their legal rights and weren't afraid to use them. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, apparently his default response when confronted with situations that his training hadn't covered. "So, is everything else about our education?" Zane observed with human pragmatism. "But irregular doesn't mean wrong." Captain Stone, who had been allowing her cubs to handle their own defense, finally stepped forward. "Inspector Krix, I think you need to consider whether your transfer orders are actually in the best interests of these cubs, or if they're designed to make your paperwork easier. The Education Authority knows what's best for developing minds," Krix protested, but his conviction was clearly wavering. "Does it?" Stone asked gently. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the Education Authority is trying to solve an administrative inconvenience by breaking up functional family units." "These aren't family units," Krix declared. "They're temporary educational groupings." The growl that emerged from 12 young throats simultaneously made it clear that the cubs had very different opinions about the temporary nature of their bonds. "Inspector," Stone continued with the kind of calm patience that made her arguments more devastating than shouting, "these cubs have achieved academic scores 23% higher than species-segregated control groups. Their psychological profiles show improved emotional stability, enhanced social cooperation, and advanced problem-solving skills. What specific educational benefits would justify disrupting these outcomes?" Krix stared at her, apparently realizing that he was being asked to defend a policy that prioritized theoretical compliance over actual results. It's procedure," he said finally, his voice lacking any conviction. "Procedure," Kia repeated, her armor plates now fully hardened and gleaming with threat displays that made everyone present extremely nervous. "Is that really your best argument for breaking up our pack? Procedure is your best argument for breaking up our pack?" Kia's question hung in the air like a challenge to the entire foundation of galactic bureaucracy. Inspector Krix's communicator chirped, and suddenly the room filled with security personnel who clearly hadn't been briefed on the philosophical complexities of the situation. 6 armed guards entered, expecting routine compliance assistance, and instead found themselves facing what looked like a wildlife documentary about apex predators defending their territory. "Secure the cubs for transfer," Krix ordered, apparently believing that superior numbers would solve his administrative problems. The lead security officer, a grizzled centurion named Sergeant Locke Vane, took one look at the defensive formation and held up a restraining hand to his team. "Inspector, are we sure this is the best approach?" "They're children," Krix insisted. "How dangerous could they possibly be?" Sergeant Vane had obviously seen more actual combat than Inspector Krix, because his expression suggested he was familiar with exactly how dangerous motivated predators could be regardless of their age. "Sir," he said carefully, "these cubs are displaying coordinated threat behaviors that indicate serious territorial defense. Forced separation could trigger aggressive responses. They're juveniles throwing tantrums," Krix declared. "Use standard compliance protocols." That's when the cubs demonstrated why standard protocols don't account for beings who've been trained by humans to think strategically under pressure. Rack stepped forward, his chitinous plates creating acoustic resonances that made the security team's equipment malfunction in interesting ways. "Sergeant Vane, are you prepared to use force against cubs who are exercising their legal rights?" "Because," Mila added, her compound eyes reflecting light in patterns that somehow made everyone uncomfortable. Article 62 of the Galactic Law Enforcement Code specifically prohibits the use of force against minors who are not presenting immediate physical threats. Zane produced another datapad, apparently having researched every legal precedent that might apply to their situation. Additionally, Section 15 of the station charter grants Captain Stone educational autonomy over cubs under her care unless formal abuse charges have been filed and proven. The security team exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that this wasn't a simple custody transfer, but a complex legal situation involving beings who knew their rights better than most adults. "Have formal abuse charges been filed?" Sergeant Vane asked Inspector Krix with professional calm. "Well, no. But then we have no legal authority to forcibly remove cubs who are refusing transfer," Vane concluded. "This becomes a civil administrative matter, not a security issue." Krix's armor plates began shifting through color patterns that indicated extreme bureaucratic frustration. "Sergeant, I'm ordering you to secure these cubs." "Sir, with respect, you don't have the authority to override galactic law," Vane replied. "If you want custody of cubs who are invoking their legal rights, you need proper judicial orders." "This is ridiculous," Krix sputtered. "They're children parroting legal terminology they don't understand." "Actually," came a new voice from the corridor entrance, "they understand it perfectly." Admiral Petra Kane entered with the kind of commanding presence that made everyone in the room suddenly stand straighter. Behind her came a woman whose appearance made Inspector Krix's armor plates shift into what looked suspiciously like panic mode. "Inspector Krix," Admiral Kane said formally, "I'd like you to meet Judge Advocate General Yara Cross, legal counsel for the Galactic Children's Rights Division." Jag Cross looked around the room, taking in the defensive formation of cubs, the confused security team, and the increasingly desperate inspector. "Inspector Krix, I understand you're attempting to forcibly transfer cubs who have invoked their legal rights to educational self-determination." "They're minors," Krix protested weakly. "They can't invoke complex legal protections. Age restrictions on legal rights only apply when cubs lack the cognitive ability to understand their implications," Cross replied with legal precision that made Krix visibly wince. "These cubs have demonstrated thorough understanding of relevant statutes and their applications. More importantly," Admiral Kane added, "these cubs have achieved educational outcomes that exceed every benchmark we use to measure institutional effectiveness. Breaking up this unit would be administratively catastrophic." Inspector Krix looked around the room at cubs who were citing legal precedent, security personnel who were refusing unlawful orders, and senior military officers who were supporting juvenile rebellion against his authority. "This is highly irregular," he said for what felt like the 100th time. "So is everything else that works," Captain Stone observed dryly. "Maybe irregular isn't the problem you think it, Island." Judge Cross activated her legal scanner and began documenting the cubs' educational records, psychological profiles, and legal competency assessments. "Inspector Krix, based on preliminary review, these cubs meet or exceed every standard for legal self-advocacy." Any attempt to override their stated preferences would require compelling evidence of harm or neglect. But they're forming inappropriate attachments, Krix protested. Sir. Define inappropriate. Cross challenged. They're treating a human as their pack leader instead of relating properly to their own species. And what specific harm does this cause? Krix opened his mouth, then closed it again as he realized he was being asked to prove that successful educational outcomes were somehow harmful. They're not learning proper species-specific behaviors, he said finally. Kea stepped forward with her armor plates gleaming in full threat display. Inspector Krix, I can perform every traditional Koran ritual, speak 3 dialects of my ancestral language, and execute combat maneuvers that most adults of my species never master. I know more about Thraxian philosophy and tactical theory than cubs who've spent their entire lives in species segregated. Education, Rax added, his mandibles creating harmonic patterns that demonstrated advanced cultural knowledge. Plus, Mila concluded, we've learned to cooperate across species boundaries, which traditional education actively discourages. Judge Cross was making notes that seemed to cause Inspector Krix physical pain. Inspector, the cubs appear to have achieved enhanced species knowledge alongside improved interspecies cooperation. Where's the educational deficiency? It's not about deficiency, Krix admitted. It's about maintaining proper social structures. Whose social structures? Admiral Kane asked with the kind of dangerous calm that preceded career-ending revelations. The ones that keep different species in their appropriate roles, Krix said, apparently deciding that honesty was his last resort. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that you could have heard atomic decay in the next system. Inspector, Judge Cross said slowly, are you suggesting that the purpose of species segregation is to maintain hierarchical power structures rather than provide optimal education? I'm suggesting that some traditions exist for important reasons, Krix replied, though his confidence was evaporating rapidly. And I'm suggesting, Captain Stone said with the kind of gentle reasonableness that made her arguments devastating, that maybe it's time to examine whether those reasons still apply. Zane stepped forward with his datapad displaying comparative statistics. Inspector Krix, cubs educated under Captain Stone's integrated methods score 37% higher on creativity assessments, 42% higher on problem-solving evaluations, and show significantly better psychological adjustment than species-segregated control groups. They also demonstrate enhanced empathy, improved communication skills, and superior ability to function in diverse environments, Mila added with Nexari precision. Most importantly, Rax concluded, his mandibles creating sounds that conveyed deep emotional satisfaction. They're happy. Inspector Krix looked around the room at cubs who were clearly thriving, officers who were supporting their rights, and legal authorities who were documenting his procedural violations. The Education Authority won't accept this, he said weakly. Then maybe, Admiral Kane suggested, the Education Authority needs to reconsider its priorities. Judge Cross finished her documentation and faced Inspector Krix with official authority. Inspector, based on my assessment, these cubs are receiving superior education that exceeds all standard benchmarks. Any attempt to disrupt this arrangement without compelling evidence of harm would violate multiple provisions of galactic children's rights law. Furthermore, she continued, the cubs have demonstrated legal competency to advocate for their educational preferences. Forced transfer under these circumstances would constitute institutional abuse. Krix's armor plates had shifted into patterns that indicated complete defeat. Hoplied. So what am I supposed to tell the authority? Tell them, Captain Stone suggested with a slight smile, that you discovered an educational innovation that produces superior outcomes and recommend expanding the program rather than terminating it. You want me to recommend irregularity as policy? I want you to recommend effectiveness as policy, Stone corrected. The irregularity is just what makes it work. 3 months later, I submitted my final report on what became known as the Atlas Incident to the Galactic Archives. Inspector Krix had indeed recommended expanding integrated education programs, though he'd managed to frame it as his own brilliant insight, rather than capitulation to cubs who understood their legal rights better than he did. The cubs remained with Captain Stone, who was promoted to Director of Experimental Education and given authority to develop similar programs across the sector. Their success had triggered a fundamental reassessment of segregated education policies that had governed galactic society for centuries. The interesting thing, I noted during my final interview with Captain Stone, is that the cubs didn't win through rebellion or defiance. They won by being so thoroughly educated that they could defend themselves intellectually. That's the point, she replied. Watching her cubs conduct advanced tactical simulations that incorporated strategies from 6 different species. Real education isn't about teaching compliance. It's about teaching competence, even when that competence challenges established authority. Especially then, she said with a smile, because the kind of thinking that never questions authority is also the kind of thinking that never solves new problems. The cubs had taught the galaxy something important that day. That the strongest families weren't created by genetic similarity or bureaucratic assignment, but by choice, respect, and the mutual decision to support each other regardless of what anyone else thought was appropriate. The education authority had tried to separate them using force, regulations, and institutional pressure. The cubs had responded by demonstrating that they were too smart, too legally informed, and too united to be separated by anything less than voluntary decision. You know, I observed to Captain Stone as we watched the cubs teaching advanced cooperation strategies to newly arrived refugee younglings. When this story gets told, people are going to focus on the legal precedents and educational innovations. Probably, she agreed. But that's not really what happened here. No, she said quietly. What happened here was that a group of cubs decided they'd found their family, and they were willing to fight anyone who tried to break it up. The cubs had snarled back at institutional authority not because they were rebellious, but because they understood that some things were worth defending. And sometimes, the most important education happens when you teach someone that they have the right to say no to people who claim to know what's best for them. The galaxy was still learning that lesson, but thanks to 12 predator cubs who refused to be separated from their chosen pack leader, it was learning faster than anyone had expected. 6 months after the Atlas incident, I found myself documenting something even more remarkable. The first interspecies educational summit, where representatives from every major educational institution in the galaxy had gathered to study what was now being called the Stone method of integrated learning. The venue was impressive enough. Grand Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime, with delegates from 43 species filling seats that had been specially designed to accommodate every conceivable body type. But the real spectacle was watching ancient academic institutions scramble to understand educational innovations that had emerged from what they'd previously dismissed as administrative irregularities. The traditional model assumes that species-segregated education provides optimal cultural transmission, announced Dr. Corvex Thane, director of the Centauri Educational Consortium, as he addressed the assembly. However, preliminary analysis of integrated education outcomes suggests we may need to revise our fundamental assumptions. Translation: they'd spent centuries being wrong, and now they were trying to figure out how to admit it without looking incompetent. Captain Stone, now Director Stone, stood at the main podium with her cubs arranged around her in what had become their signature formation. But these weren't the same cubs who'd faced down Inspector Krix 6 months earlier. They'd grown, not just physically but intellectually, into something that challenged every category the educational establishment used to classify young minds. Honored delegates, Stone began, her voice carrying across the vast hall through advanced translation systems. We're here today because 12 cubs refused to accept that genetic similarity was more important than chosen family. The cubs stepped forward, each representing not just their own species but the revolutionary principle that diversity strengthened rather than weakened educational outcomes. Rax, now wearing the insignia of a certified tactical instructor despite being barely past adolescence, addressed the Thraxian delegation directly. Traditional Thraxian education emphasizes individual achievement through competitive isolation. I've learned that cooperative achievement produces superior results while maintaining cultural identity. His mandibles created harmonic patterns that conveyed complex philosophical concepts, proving that integrated education had enhanced rather than diminished his species-specific abilities. Moreover, he continued, cooperation with other species has taught me strategic approaches that purely Thraxian thinking would never develop. I'm now more effective as a Thraxian because I understand non-Thraxian perspectives. Kea addressed the Koran military representatives with armor plates that gleamed with confidence. Traditional Koran education teaches that strength comes from dominance over perceived inferiors. I've learned that true strength comes from lifting others up while rising yourself. She gestured to her packmates with obvious pride. My defensive capabilities have improved 43% since learning to protect beings different from myself. Protecting diversity requires more sophisticated skills than protecting uniformity. Mila's compound eyes reflected data streams as she addressed the Nexari analytical community. Species-segregated education limits data input to familiar patterns and known variables. Integrated education exposes us to novel thinking processes that enhance computational creativity and problem-solving efficiency. Additionally, she added with typical Nexari precision, emotional intelligence improves dramatically when you learn to interpret expressions, body language, and behavioral cues across species boundaries. But it was Zane who delivered the statement that made the assembled delegates truly uncomfortable. The most important thing we've learned, he said, his young voice carrying across the hall with surprising authority, is that adults often mistake control for education. Real learning happens when you're trusted to think for yourself, not when you're trained to repeat approved thoughts. The silence that followed this observation suggested that several centuries of educational philosophy had just been politely but thoroughly demolished by a human teenager. Dr. Valera Cast, representing the Academic Council of Traditional Values, stood to address what she clearly considered dangerous precedent. These outcomes, while impressive, may be anomalous. Expanding such programs risks disrupting established social stability. Established social stability, Rax repeated thoughtfully. For whom? The question that had stumped Inspector Krix apparently worked just as effectively on academic administrators. For everyone, Doctor. Cast replied uncertainly. Not for cubs who are told their natural relationships are inappropriate, Kea observed with characteristic directness. Not for species who are denied opportunities to learn from each other, Mila added. And definitely not for anyone who benefits from cooperative problem-solving rather than competitive isolation, Zane concluded. Director Stone stepped forward with data displays that made the assembled academics lean forward despite themselves. Delegates, we've now documented outcomes from 17 different integrated education programs across 9 sectors. The results are consistent. Cubs in integrated programs show superior academic performance, enhanced emotional stability, improved creative thinking, and significantly better preparation for real-world challenges. But more importantly, she continued, they're happy. They form lasting bonds, develop genuine confidence, and learn to see diversity as an asset rather than a threat. Ambassador Quinn Vortex, representing species whose historical conflicts had made cooperation seem impossible, raised a concern that many were thinking. Director Stone, what about cubs from species with traditional enmities? Can integration overcome biological and cultural hostilities? The cubs exchanged glances and seemed to come to some collective decision. Watch, Kea said simply. What followed was a demonstration that made every delegate in the hall question their assumptions about species compatibility. The cubs performed a complex tactical exercise that required perfect coordination between natural enemies, using strategies that incorporated the unique advantages of each species while compensating for their individual limitations. Thraxian spatial reasoning, combined with Koran defensive instincts, enhanced by Nexari analytical processing and human adaptive thinking. The result was tactical effectiveness that exceeded what any single species could achieve alone. Traditional education teaches us to compete with other species, Rax explained, as they concluded their demonstration. Integrated education teaches us to complement other species. Competition creates winners and losers, Mila observed. Complementarity creates success for everyone involved. The demonstration had lasting effects beyond the immediate educational discussions. Within hours, military observers were requesting detailed analyses of the tactical innovations they'd witnessed. Diplomatic corps began studying the cooperation protocols. Trade organizations started examining the economic implications of genuine interspecies collaboration. What we're witnessing, announced Fleet Admiral Petra Kane during the summit's concluding session, isn't just educational innovation. It's the emergence of post-species thinking that could reshape galactic civilization. The Cubs have shown us something remarkable, she continued, gesturing toward where they stood with Director Stone. They've proven that diversity isn't something to be managed or contained. It's something to be celebrated and utilized. Dr. Thane, who had begun the summit defending traditional methods, found himself announcing policy reversals that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. The Centauri Educational Consortium will be implementing pilot integrated programs in 12 sectors, with full expansion planned pending outcome assessments. Similar announcements followed from delegates across the hall. Species that had maintained educational isolation for millennia were suddenly eager to experiment with cooperative learning models. But the real victory wasn't in the policy changes or institutional reforms. It was in the simple fact that 12 Cubs had refused to accept limitations that others had tried to impose on their chosen family, and in doing so had opened possibilities that nobody had imagined. You know, I said to Director Stone as we watched delegates from formerly hostile species planning cooperative educational initiatives, when you first refused to let Inspector Krix separate your Cubs, did you realize you were starting a revolution? She smiled as she watched Rax teaching Koran tactical theory to a mixed group of younglings, while Kea demonstrated Thraxian defensive strategies, and Mila conducted cross-species psychological assessments with the casual competence of someone who'd never learned such things were supposed to be difficult. I realized, she said quietly, that some fights are worth having, regardless of the consequences. Sometimes the most important thing you can teach someone is that they have the right to say no to people who claim authority over their happiness. The Cubs had snarled back at institutional pressure, not because they were rebels, but because they understood that family was something you chose and protected, regardless of what species you happened to be. The galaxy had tried to separate them using regulations, traditions, and the weight of centuries of precedent. They had responded by demonstrating that love, loyalty, and mutual respect were stronger than any bureaucratic authority, and in the process, they had accidentally revolutionized the entire concept of education, proving that the best learning happened when you were trusted to think for yourself and valued for who you chose to become rather than what you were expected to be.